Hey, what's up, class? Another video. This one we're talking about Indian cinema. And when you talk about Indian cinema, it's very complex because they are a diverse country. They are most culturally diverse, one of the most largest and culturally diverse in the world, second only to China in population, and second only to the United States in the scale of importance to film industry. Indian films are popular not only in India itself, but also in large parts of Asia and Africa and many other countries. While Bombay was and is the center of Indian film production, film industries grew up early in the century throughout the subcontinent, in Calcutta, Madras, Lahore, and other major centers, based on their activity on theatrical and artistic modes which combine Western and indigenous models. Bombay and the Parsi theater. History in India is likened to show often expresses itself geographically. In Bombay, even today, an arc in the heart of the city swings from the textile mills of Parel and Lombok to the famous dockyards adjoining Rear Road, the second giant market core bazaar, the red light area in Falkland Road, and towards the industrial wholesale trade up to Lahore Charles and Crawford Market. This area is not over 10 square miles, saw the rise of the first industrial working class in India, and was the base of the country's colonial economy on the west coast. It was also the place where Indian film industry was born. The country's trader capitalists, the kind who invested in the nascent entertainment industries of theater and then film, emerged as a powerful economic class mainly through coastal tradings with the West. The West, Middle East, and palaces in major cities were converted en masse. I'm sorry, let me back up. They emerged as a powerful economic class mainly through coastal trading with the West, Middle East, and China. The Parsi theater, often considered the direct ancestor of the song and dance action stereotype of the Hindi cinema, established itself as an industry when Sir James Jijoboi bought the Bombay Theatre in 1835. Jijoboi was one of India's biggest trader industrialists with a flourishing export business with China and Europe in silk, yarn, cotton, and handcrafts, and later founded the influential art academy, the JJ School. While the Bombay Theatre had begun in 1776, it was built as a straight copy of London's Drury Lane Theatre. The combination established both a genre and an industry. The Bombay Theatre was followed by an even more famous Grant Road Theatre. In its earliest days, film exhibition was restricted to traveling tents theaters using the Edison and after 1907 the Path projection system. So they didn't have theaters; they were just traveling tents. From 1910, however, the first cinemas began to be built, while the famous theater palaces in the major cities were converted en masse into bioscope projection houses. When the Lumiere shorts were unveiled as the marvel of the century, the wonder of the world, on July 7th, 1896, it was at Bombay's elite Watson Hotel, but film then moved to the native Novelty Theatre and formed premises of the city's most famous Parsi stage repertory. In Maharashtra, the Shahu Maharaja of Kolumpur had already had an extensive theatrical interest, financed the first movie studio in the region, the Maharashtra Film Company, and that was in 1917, and it lasted until 1932. It was started by a low-caste painter of stage prop, Bamburo painter. The studio took part in the Renaissance in popular Marathi stage music. In Andhra Pradesh, it was the Sabari Theatre's troops featured in the first big movies in Telugu. On the Punjab. In Lahore, the cultural and economic capital of the Punjab, which is now Pakistan, in 1901 saw two developments that transformed the Indian entertainment industry. The Gardner Mahavidyalaya was set up that year, a school of music that was for the first time made classical music training available outside the feudal system. And it caused a major revolution by publishing musical texts till now jealously guarded by various Ganadas. It led to major spread of the music school system, throwing up most of the major stage musicians and then singing stars like Prabhat Studios, Shante Apte, and still more influentially composers like Rafiq Ganjanavi and Master Krishnanaro. Meanwhile, a land act that year curtailed urban investment in agriculture, and it led to the large-scale investment in the entertainment business. And this initially took form of theater building for the first stage and then for film. In the Maidan theaters, the cultural transition of India's 19th century mercantile elite is best demonstrated by the spectacular career of the controversial Maidan Theatre. Founded in Calcutta, by Jamsdi Maidan, a former actor in the Bombay Parsi Theatre. Maidan caused a business revolution when he acquired two front-ranking Bombay companies, Kaftu Alfred and the Elphinstone, including their theater premises, rights to all their productions, and their repertory of actors and writers. Maidan saw the cinematic crossover potential of his own theatrical property relatively late in his spectacular career as an entrepreneur. He first moved into film when he bought agency rights for Path, converting his own theaters into projection houses. He then went on to acquire theaters until at its peak, the Maidan distribution empire ran 172 theaters throughout the subcontinent and earned half of the national box office. That's a lot. Maidan was explicit in his marketing plan of catering to the anglicized urban elite. For several years, distributed hardly any Indian films. This marketing strategy had several cultural resonances, not perhaps evident on the surface. During the war, Maidan had taken advantage of wartime subsidies to build theaters for the entertainment of British troops. By the time Maidan Theatre moved into film productions around 1917, the group's idea of updating the Parsi theater's classicist aspirations came to mean very different things politically from the group's heyday a decade or two earlier. In the first years, the Maidan brand of Orientalism was crucially determined by its key auteur, Agha Hajmer Kashmiri, with star Patience Cooper playing an early version of Nargis. Political resonances. By the 1920s, the idea of indigenously manufactured popular culture on par with the West, which was to be the dominant refrain of the 1927-28 Indian cinematograph committee, headed by Dewar Bahanduri, had opened into a new political era. The Swadeshi in 1918, the Montagu reforms, which allowed for the first time a limited Indian participation in government while calling for the revitalization of post-war Indian industry. It also brought about the first legalization on the Indian cinema. In 1918, the Cinematograph Act instituted censorship and a licensing policy for film theaters. Municipal and police rules followed in 1920, stipulating that films must be shown only in built-up premises, and asserted the need for greater financial accountability on the part of distributors. In 1926 came the proposal for the Empire Films Corporation, a British initiative meant to revive the British film industry by reserving compulsory screen time for films made inside the empire. There was wide disagreement amongst Indian producers over this proposal. Some felt that as the preeminent film industry in the British Empire, the Indian cinema should legitimately claim its share of the compulsory screen time and thus export to other countries in the empire, while others argued that similar proposals and other industries had never worked in the past. It was only one set of numerous arguments and dissensions as the process of nationalist hegemony finally came of age in the cinema, and cinema started to be acknowledged as the most influential of India's popular arts. Swadeshi to melodrama, the reform of film. In 1895, the long social reform movement in India entered a new phase in protest against the discriminatory cotton tariffs imposed by the British government. The Swadeshi movement was launched. Literally, Swadeshi, meaning own country, it became in 1905 the major plank of the nascent Congress Party as a nationalist call to boycott all foreign manufactured goods. On the one side, this was a straightforward assertion that India had developed indigenous industry, but the movement also claimed linguistic cultural justifications in terms of indigenous traditions. So there's this fight of culture between the empire and the indigenous people of India. The two sides did not always mesh together, and from the onset, capitalist ambitions of the traders and investors ran counter to Gandhi's view that Swadeshi industry had to see itself in radically different terms from the colonial industry and concentrate, for instance, on the rural uplift. These conflicts at the heart of the Swadeshi movement found a powerful focus in the development of indigenous Indian cinema. All the big studios in Bombay established in 1920s felt the rumbles, the Kohinoor, the Imperial, the Ranjit, the Movietone, and slightly later the Sagar Film Company were all started through the expansion of the film exhibition sector. All four had been established along the lines of Hollywood studios, committed to building an in-house star system and production assembly line, and all were initially influenced largely by colonial Orientalist stereotypes of company school, painting, and the Parsi theater. Imperial. The Imperial was established in 1926 by former exhibitor Ardeshi Irani, known for having produced the country's first sound feature, Alam Ara. It had created several major in-house stars in the silent area, of which the most famous was Sulochana, playing the Theda Bara-style roles in films like Wildcat of Bombay and in costume periods like Anarkali. Indian realism at this time developed via folk, some of its most influential reference points, inflected in the direction of indigenism in a combative cultural struggle around the Swadeshi debate. Its two major extensions were made into the 1940 in the mythological and in the Orientalist drama. The social reform novel on the bottom of 403. By the late 1920s, the social reform novel had replaced the stereotypes of the company school with a different brand of authenticity. Through the late 19th century, the reform novel had established itself in several Indian languages, notably Bengali, Marathi, and Telugu. Malayalam Kannada, Urdu, and Gujarati effectively launches the first modernist movement in those regions and narrativizes a series of mutations of traditions into a reformist discourse of middle-class neo-traditionalism. By the 1920s, it had established itself in the popular literary mainstream with the rise of literary journals, the short story, and serialized fiction, establishing a main literary stereotypes virtually waiting to be transformed into theatrical cinematic language. Ranjit and Sagar. I'm on the bottom of page 405. The two studios with which best succeeded in translating reform literature into genre of filmic melodramas were the Ranjit Movietone and the Sagar Film Company. Ranjit, established in 1929 as an offshoot of the Kohinoor, supported simultaneously by by Jangnobar Royalty and by Motor General Finance Company, employed a new generation of scenarists to script for its famous in-house female lead, the glorious Gauhar. The Sagar Film Company, established in 1930 as a subsidiary of the Imperial Studios, also started off making reform socials and hired the politician, playwright, and novelist K.M. Munshi. The intersection of pervasive neo-traditional popular art, politics, and cultural authorship is particularly evident in the best-known cinema of the third production center in the country. Madras Cinema effectively began here with R. Najarati Mabolers, whose six mythologicals between 1916 and 1923 inaugurated what K. Sivathambi suggests was a remarkable function of the cinema, to provide for virtually the first time in modern Tamil history an egalitarian audience space, violating the class caste biases traditionally segregating audiences. So they had India has a very strict caste system, even more strict back then. And so what the studio did was, for the first time, integrated the caste system in a single audience. By the mid-1930s, prefiguring the all India cinema aesthetic inaugurated by success, notably the Chandalakara series, a series of economic shifts had already established the preconditions of greater market integrations through the country. The volume of film imports had leveled off and even declined, paralleling the boom in indigenous trading during the war years. More and more financiers representing the managing agency system had begun investing in film. Several studios, including Rajat and New Theaters, benefited. From this new area of high-interest finance, Bombay Talkies, which were established in 1934, originated in Orientalist international co-productions set up in the silent period. In 1942, a breakaway group set up the spectacularly successful Filmistan Studios, and Bombay Talkies went into decline, losing the services of all the big stars of the Hindi film industry. But by 1947, through the initiative of Bombay Talkies and its successors, the film melodrama had acquired the status of the privileged form of representation of the industrialized, modernized nation state, and the means by which the key hegemonies in forming the post-war and post-Swadeshi idea of a national culture were exposed. The triumphant mercantile class of investors who replaced the studio system soon after the war also symbolized for directors like Raj Kapoor and Guru Dutt the state of a nation that specifically excluded their utopia. Okay, we're going to end that right there. See you on the next video.